The release of TypeScript 6 later this year will be an important step toward TypeScript 7, where the TypeScript compiler will be replaced with a 10 times faster Go version. In this video, we will cover all the deprecated features and breaking changes which could affect your projects, so you can update your code ahead of time and be ready when TypeScript 6 is released. Let's get started. So the first deprecation we will look into for TypeScript 6 is regarding the rootDir property. Now we have this tsconfig JSON here, which does not contain any configuration. And let's see what happens when we are just trying to compile our project. We have this source folder here with the main TS in there. Now when I use tsc, and tsc currently points to a TypeScript 5 compiler, when I run this, we can see that now I get a main.js file right beside my main TS file. So let's remove this again, and let's say we want to have a different out directory. So we say we have our outdir and we point this to our /dist folder. Now when I run this again, this should work perfectly fine, and we can see we have now this dist folder and it contains this main.js file. Now this is exactly what we expected, but let's now remove again our dist folder. But let's now try to run exactly the same command with TypeScript 6. So I'm using tsc6 as an alias, and when I run this, we will see that we get an error here. Before we go into this error, let's see what happens in the dist folder. When we open this, we can see it created the source folder, and in there is now our main.js file. Because now in TypeScript 6 and later in TypeScript 7, the rootDir property will always point to the path where the tsconfig JSON is. So this means that it is now required that we specify this root directory explicitly. And we can also see that we get an error because of that, because we also need to specify the rootDir to make sure that we point it to our source folder. So how can we do this? Well, we just explicitly tell our tsconfig file that our rootdir is source. And now let's remove our dist folder again, and let's run tsc6 again. And we will see that we now have our dist folder again, but now there is no source folder in there. We just have again our main.js file like we had prior. Now, also something important for that is that rootdirs, so the other property, but just like the plural form of it, will not change. You can just add all the folders in there you still want, and you don't have to specify anything special or have to change anything in there. They only change the behavior of rootdir by default. Another really big deprecation which will happen in TypeScript 6 is the deprecation of certain targets in the tsconfig file. So let me show you what happens when I enable the target property here and I set it to ES5. When I save this, we will see an error, because when we hover over this, we can see that target ES5 is deprecated and will stop functioning in ES7. So the TypeScript team decided to no longer support ES5 in newer versions of TypeScript. This means that the lowest version you can use is ES 2015. But I think this is really reasonable, because ES 2015 was released more than 10 years ago, so in my opinion it's perfectly fine that they removed this old target. But the TypeScript team did not only remove the target ES5, they also changed the default ECMAScript target. So if you're not specifying any target in your tsconfig file, starting with TypeScript 6, this will always refer to the current ECMAScript version when this TypeScript version was compiled. So for example, when the current version was ES 2025, then this will be the target, and so on. But of course, if you want to change this, you can still specify any version you want, which is still available in there. But if you do not specify any version, then the implicit default will be the ECMAScript version, which is currently active. But of course, they are not using ES Next. They are always using a fixed version, like for example, ES 2024 and so on. The next deprecation we will look into is also happening in the tsconfig file, and it is regarding the module resolution. Now let's enable this module resolution for Node here, and we can immediately see that we get an error. When we hover over this, we can see that the module resolution Node 10 is deprecated and will also stop functioning in TypeScript 7. Why is this the case? Well, the module resolution type node or node 10, they are alias, are really outdated, and like many new features, like for example the distinction between common.js and ESM files. And this module resolution was used mostly in a wrong way by people who developed either Node.js applications or web applications. Now, how can we migrate from these module resolutions which are deprecated to the ones which are not deprecated? Now, let's first see how we want to migrate them when we want to create a simple Node.js application. When we want to migrate it for the Node.js application, this is really easy. The only change we have to do is we have to specify the module, and in there we specify Node Next. When we specify Node Next, this means that we implicitly will get the module resolution for Node. So if you're creating a Node.js application, just set module to node next and it will work as before. But what is the case with web applications? Web projects that rely on moduleResolution node often rely on CommonJS specific behaviors, like for example extensionless imports. Often these projects are using ESNext emit and opt-in to moduleResolution node or node 10. But it could also be the case that they use CommonJS as the module, and then we get moduleResolution node implicitly and by default. Now, how should we migrate these projects? The first thing we should do is we should switch from module CommonJS to ESNext, and we should also specify the moduleResolution to bundler. This should take care of most cases, and it should be perfectly fine to use it like this. But what if you still want to use CommonJS in TypeScript 6 or 7? If you're using CommonJS like this will be a version of CommonJS which is like overly permissive, but which still understands and prefers most modern Node.js behavior. Now for the next deprecation in TypeScript 6, let's stay at the module property here, because the TypeScript team decided to deprecate quite some modules. The first they will deprecate and will remove in TypeScript 7 is UMD. UMD will no longer be allowed in future versions. So we can see here currently we get this error which tells that the UMD module is deprecated and it will also stop functioning in TypeScript 7. And the same is also for AMD, which will also no longer be supported in TypeScript 7, and also systemjs. So if you are still using these modules, you have to switch to other ones which are still available. Now we have looked a little bit into how the compilation works, but let's now take a look into some changes how our paths get resolved in TypeScript 6 and 7. Because a property which will get deprecated in TypeScript 6 and removed entirely in TypeScript 7 is the baseUrl. The baseUrl had to be used in combination with the paths property. So let me show you what this means. Let's say we have a source as our baseUrl, and then we have our paths in here. We have an app and everything which is in there. This just routes to app/star. So this worked perfectly fine. But what was the issue? Well, the issue was that this did not work as expected because TypeScript then tried to resolve the files in other paths than we might have expected. Because when we used, for example, import star as foo from foo.js, then TypeScript tried to resolve it at different locations. So when we did the import like this, TypeScript tried to resolve it in more than just the app directory. So the first thing, of course, is it tried to resolve it in /source app foo.js. But what also happened was it tried to resolve it in the directory of the baseUrl, so in foo.js. And this often was not intended by the developer who used the baseUrl like this. This is why they removed the baseUrl entirely. Now you're maybe thinking, well, how can I still make these paths work as before? And it is a little bit cumbersome, but we now need to prefix all our paths in here with the baseUrl. So for example, for our app, we have to prefix it with source/app. And then we can remove our baseUrl like this to make it compatible for TypeScript 6 and 7. Now, if you still want that foo.js gets looked up in this baseUrl, what you can do is to make it still backwards compatible, you can add another path and we just add a star in here. And we then can say that it still should resolve in /source star. And this will then make it work as before with our baseUrl. But in all cases, you always have to specify it with this prefix, which earlier was the baseUrl. Now, after we have fixed our paths, let's now take a look into a property which they changed the default from true to false, namely the libReplacement property. LibReplacement was added in a quite frequent version of TypeScript 5, and when it is not explicitly set to false, it will take a look into node modules /add TypeScript, and in there it will look for types which start with lib dash, and then it scans the lib property for additional types. So for example, we have our lib in here, and when we say we have our foo, then it will also take a look in node modules TypeScript lib foo for additional types. And because this also takes some time, this also needs to read some files, this will no longer be enabled by default. So if you want this to be enabled in the future, you have to enable it yourself explicitly. So let's now check the, in my opinion, most important change in TypeScript 6 regarding the configuration. Because the TypeScript team decided they want to set the strict property to true by default. We had the strict property for quite some time, and when we used tsc init, then strict was by default always set to true in the config file. So this meant that strict was set to true when you created your tsconfig file. But now they want to go one step further. They want to enable the strict property by default even when it's not set in the tsconfig file, so like an implicit default. This means that in the future, even when you don't have strict set to true, when you're using TypeScript 6, this will be true implicitly. Now they are still working on the change, how the different other properties should work. For example, if you're using any of these other strict properties, what then should be overwritten, and the proposal is still open, but they are committed to add it to TypeScript 6. So if you're not using strict currently and you're switching to TypeScript 6, don't worry, you of course still have the possibility to change this from true to false, and it will work as before, but keep this in mind when you are upgrading to TypeScript 6 that you have to set this explicitly, otherwise some of your code might not compile as before. We are almost done with the tsconfig changes, but last but not least, also take a look in the types property, because there were some significant changes in this property. Because when you did not set the types property explicitly before, TypeScript just went into types/ and looked into all the different types. This was especially useful when you wanted to use it like for globals, like for example with node. What this then allowed was, for example, when you use const fs and you say require, and you say fs, it took the types from @types node and enabled it for you in your file. So you did not have to specify node in here because TypeScript implicitly did that for you if you did not specify any types in here. Now they changed that. This will now no longer work. If you are not specifying anything explicitly, then TypeScript will not resolve these global types for you. But there is an important distinction. Of course, TypeScript will still check at types in no modules. This is only the case when you're using it like for globals, for example like the Node.js globals. But for everyone who is not relying on global types, this does not affect you at all. You can still just use your normal import of your files and you will have access to the types. This will work perfectly fine. It's really just you have to tell explicitly which types TypeScript has to look up for these globals. But for this property, they provide a backwards compatibility. So what you can do is you can just explicitly provide this types property, and instead of saying node and all your other types, you just add a star in there and this will work as before. Now that we are done with all the changes in our tsconfig file, let's now switch over to our main TS file to see a change in how we write our code. And this change is regarding the so-called import assertions. Now let's say we have an import here and we say star as foo from, and we want to import a foo.json file. Now before, what we could do is we could say asserts type is JSON. Now, what does this asserts mean? This asserts was in an ECMAScript proposal, but it was not approved this way, but it was available in earlier TypeScript versions. So instead of using asserts, what we now will do is we will switch it to with. So this is quite a simple change. You only have to change all your asserts to with where you are using your import assertions. Now, the last really cool change they will release in TypeScript 6 is the assumption that we use strict everywhere. Use strict, or also the so-called strict mode, is used to determine certain behaviors which JavaScript then should not allow. For example, when you are not using strict, the following thing would be allowed. You could say var a equals await, and this would be perfectly fine if there is no use strict at the top of your JavaScript file. If it is, then this will not be allowed. And the TypeScript team decided that it will just assume that everywhere useStrict is used. And this also means that they will emit useStrict unconditionally in all non-ES module files. And I think this is a perfectly fine assumption, and they should really do this because nowadays almost everyone uses useStrict, and the people who are not using useStrict most likely are also not using TypeScript.